Hey everyone, and welcome back to another F1 Roundup brought to you by the brilliant Seedream app. I'm sorry that this one's a little bit later than normal, but I have just arrived, believe it or not, in Istanbul, having come from Austin at the US Grand Prix. It feels like I've been traveling for about 2 days now, but I'm finally here. I've been reflecting on what I thought was an excellent race. I was there commentating for the BBC, and at the end of that race, I felt like there'd been action all the way through the field. I thought the back marker action was just as good as whatever happened up front. A wonderful display from the Ferrari drivers, of course. Nice to see them really join that title fight, which they most definitely have done off the back of that race. And they've got a car that worked very, very well around there. It was one of those weekends where the form book just seemed to be slightly up in the air, didn't it? McLaren seemed to have lost a little bit of pace. Red Bull had gained a bit back, and Ferrari had taken giant steps forward. Mercedes, from the last of these top four teams, if you like, Mercedes were a bit all over the place. They had a massive amount of pace when it came to sprint qualifying, certainly in the hands of George Russell. Just 12 thousandths of a second separating him and the eventual pole sitter, Max Verstappen. And yet it seemed so peaky and so on the edge that neither driver was able to deliver that consistently. And actually, in the compromises they had to make in terms of their setup to get that car race ready, they both disappeared backwards. George actually did a really good job of bringing home decent haul of points, having started from the pit lane. But I think they were as surprised as most people about just how up and down their performance had been. I guess it's a disappointing weekend from them. Certainly from Lewis Hamilton, very uncharacteristic mistake. And I think it signifies just how on the edge that Mercedes is. To get the lap time out of it is so on the edge. And speaking to people up and down the paddock, speaking to those at Mercedes, they say that this generation of cars, particularly this year, where you've got to get them so low down to the ground to generate maximum downforce from the underfloor aerodynamics, you've got to get so low that once you start getting down to critical ride height levels, you start bottoming out, you start hitting curbs, and then you start being compromised when you do get a bumpy track like we had there, and you get gusty wind and different changes of direction, which is another major factor this weekend. But riding the curves with a car that's sitting so low and so on the edge of its performance window can easily get you spat off and spun round, which happened to both drivers at different points in the weekend. But inevitably, we have to talk about the big moment, because the one thing that everybody's talking about off the back of that race is the moment or moments between Lando Norris and Max Verstappen. Before I give you my thoughts on that, let me quickly tell you about Seedream. Seedream is what I think is the best app for Formula One fans out there. It's totally free. I, along with a couple of colleagues, have been developing this for a few years now in the background, and we feel like we've got it to a place where it's genuinely an app that has all of the information you need from all of your trusted sources, whether that's written content, whether it's social feeds, videos. You no longer need to go searching around the net for all this stuff, because we have got it put conveniently in one single easy to use app. The development process has been long, it's been iterative, but we've now got to a place where it's the first app that I open every single morning, and I would love that to be the case for you too. You can download it via the link in this description, or just go and search Seedream wherever you get your apps from. Right, Lando Norris and Max Verstappen. Let's just get straight into it. If anyone was listening to our BBC coverage over the weekend, you will have heard me calling the race, and at the time, I thought the penalty was a fair penalty. I'll go on to explain that in a moment. I still stand by that, by the way. I think the penalty was absolutely justified, and the stewards didn't really have too much of an option other than to give a penalty to Lando Norris. I'll explain that first. The reason I think that they had their hands tied was because it was an absolute slam dunk that Lando overtook Max whilst off the track. Now, the guidelines, the racing rules, whatever you want to call them, absolutely prohibit that. And therefore, it's a slam dunk 5-second penalty if you overtake somebody or gain a lasting advantage, as they term it, off the track, outside of track limits. There's no question Lando did that. Then you've got to come to the question of, well, why did that happen and how did it happen? Why was he out there in the first place? And of course, there's the argument that Max Verstappen pushed him off. They both ran wide, and that was why Lando ended up so far out, and that was why the overtake happened in the first place. which is also potentially true. But it feels to me like you've got to judge these as two separate incidents. One of those incidents, i.e. the overtaking off track, there's no question. There's not even a debate about it. It happened. It's a slam dunk. Nobody can argue that Lando overtook Max whilst outside track limits. Guaranteed 5-second penalty. The bit that's arguable, certainly it's subjective and you will have your own opinions, I'm sure, is whether or not Max Verstappen pushed Lando Norris off and was deserving of a penalty for that incident. Now, depending on whichever side of that you fall, and I'll tell you my opinion in a moment, but the point is that one is subjective because there's always going to be mitigating circumstances, there's always going to be arguments on both sides. It's not the clear-cut slam dunk situation when it comes to overtaking outside of the track limits. That one you can't argue with. The Max Verstappen one is going to be always down to the opinions of the stewards. Some of those, sometimes, because they don't have standard stewards at every race, sometimes you'll get a steward that'll look at that and go, well, no, it's just hard, fair racing. Yes, maybe could have given a little bit more racing room, but, you know, this is hard racing, and I think that's fair enough. Personally, I think that's kind of the side that I fall on with that particular incident. Another day, a different type of steward might go, well, no, he could have left a little bit more room on the outside rather, for Lando to come round, therefore not shoving him off. And also, you know, Max went right outside the track limits himself. He definitely didn't need to do that to push Lando as wide as he did. So there are arguments on both sides. Max Verstappen, though, knows all of these rules very well. We've seen him exploit them over and over again. Love him or loathe him, he is very good at doing that. And let's just quickly say, the battles up to the point when that particular moment happened were amazing. Lando doing everything he could in a car that probably wasn't quite quick enough. Max Verstappen having to use everything at his disposal to defend in all of the right places. Also doing a brilliant job. It was brilliant racing. I did not want to see it come to an end. That was exactly what Formula One should be. The end of a Grand Prix, two different strategies converging in the closing laps, great racing as a result of it. We got all of that stuff. So let's just quickly go back to my thoughts on the Max side of this particular story. I think what everybody wants is consistency. And I think that's probably all anybody wants. Whatever we decide is right or wrong, we just want it to be the same all the way through, whether it's one set of stewards or another, one particular racetrack or another, or even one driver or another. We want consistency because that keeps racing fair. But it is a very difficult thing to be super consistent when there are so many variables at play and you don't have the same stewards at every single racetrack. Plus, of course, with the nuances of each particular racetrack and each corner at a certain racetrack, there are also slightly different variables that go into any decision that's subjective, like the one where we think Max may have pushed Lando off the racetrack. People will throw the argument, well, didn't he just do the same thing at turn one on the opening lap and didn't get a penalty? And you could easily argue that absolutely did that. And the one thing I would say, and I'm certainly not standing here or sitting here just defending Max before you all come at me with some kind of international bias. It's normally a British bias, but I'm sure you'll find a way to spin it the other way, those who like to get into that argument. At lap one, turn one, the stewards do always look at these things slightly differently. They give a little bit of extra leeway because the tension, the emotions, the sheer number of cars is all so much higher on the opening lap of the Grand Prix. That has always been the way the stewards have looked at the opening lap incidents, just a little bit differently. I do think that there's a good argument to say Max did exactly the same thing, knew exactly what he was doing on that lap, and you know, he does that very well. So what's the solution to all of this? Because I think one question a lot of people will have is, how do you go racing against Max if he's able to do these kind of things and push you off the racetrack and not get a penalty for it? We went through a couple of years ago a really big deal about the stewards saying, look, we're going to just try and let them race. This is going to be our new philosophy. We don't want to be throwing penalties every single time the cars go onto track. We want to let them race. And I love that as a philosophy. I love the idea behind that. All day today as I've been traveling, I've been trying to think, what would happen if you just literally took away those guidelines, other than anything that's related to safety, and let them race? So if they do go off the racetrack, well, that's so be it. That's what happened. That's what happened if you go back to the 70s and 80s. Every now and again, a driver and a car went off the racetrack and they'd have to come back and fight again at the next corner. If we let the drivers sort it out, what would happen? Now, the conclusion I came to with this is in most cases, I think the drivers would sort it all out. You would take the amount of risk you think is justified, depending on the race situation, maybe a championship situation. That's how it should be. You judge your risk at any given moment. That's what racing is all about. The drivers can judge how far they want to go into a corner, how much they're willing to lay on the line. That could all be just sorted out by the drivers. These are the best guys in the world in these cars. But I think what would happen is that you're going to get more and more of what Max Verstappen potentially did this weekend. This intentional, if that's what we think it was, running a driver wide at a corner. The next question then is that a problem? And my conclusion to this is I don't think it is. I think we should just let them go for it and let them race. And yes, if one driver edges another driver out, that's what happens. If you were doing this at Monaco and there was a wall on the outside, the driver behind would literally have to back off and yield the corner if he wasn't so far in front that the only way a driver on the inside could squeeze a driver out would be to make contact. No driver wants to make contact because it would end their race. The only reason Max was able to do what he did was because there wasn't a wall on the outside. There was a whole bunch of runoff area, and it allowed him to shove that driver off without major consequence. Lando had the ability to keep running wide to avoid the contact, and he had the space to do so. So we could look at gravel traps, we could look at circuit configurations that prevent that happening. But I kind of think, let's just let them go for it and figure it out. If somebody does something that's dangerous, of course, there's got to be a penalty applied. And that will always come back down to the subjective nature of what the stewards have to judge whether something was dangerous or not. But that is what's always been the way in Formula One. If we say safety is the limit, you breach a safety limit, you're in trouble. But other than that, it's good, hard wheel-to-wheel racing within the confines of the circuit. And by that, I mean the confines of the racetrack, not the white lines necessarily, because if you've got space like we had at the weekend, allow the drivers to push each other, to shove each other. And if you want to try a big, bold move around the outside, try it. The one thing that I haven't found a solution to in my own head when I've been thinking about the potential consequences of this kind of philosophy is when you get drivers cutting a corner. So instead of running around the outside and going wide when you're challenging or trying for an overtake, what about when drivers start cutting the corners? I don't know if anyone saw any of the Porsche racing at the Circuit of the Americas this weekend, but it was a joke. It was absolutely farcical. Drivers just literally cutting chicanes, missing out the whole chicane, all four wheels well off the racetrack on the inside. And that clearly we can't have. We have to have some kind of track limitation. I think what I'm talking about is when it comes to wheel-to-wheel battles, when it comes to racing each other, let's let them push those limits. Can't have them cutting corners on a qualifying lap or on a lap where they're trying to go for a lap time. That's got to be punishable. That is effectively just cheating. But when it comes to battle, we want to see these guys pushing each other. We don't want to discourage the kind of racing we saw up to that point by making the rule book so big, so heavy, and so easy to deploy at any given moment. So that's kind of my opinion on this. Can we not get back to anything outside of breaching safety limits and safety rules? Just let them race. By all means, let's make circuits easier to race on with things like gravel traps, if that's what we feel. Let's make the circuit configurations lead into great racing, but let's not have the rule book and the stewards be the ones to continually decide how these races turn out. And in doing so, change the mindset and the philosophy of these drivers when they're in the car. Nobody wants to push the limits too greatly because they fear a 5-second penalty coming their way. Can't we just let them sort it out? And if somebody runs wide, and even if they manage to gain some kind of advantage, you go back and you spend a couple of laps catching them and you go for it as well. And if you feel you can take the risk, like Lando did by going around the outside, you go for it. I want to know all of your thoughts on that. Please let me know. There are so many talking points around that. I'm sure you've all got your own opinions. They are all valid opinions. This is what's so beautiful about live sport. Everybody will have their own opinion. Don't come at me with opinions just based because you're a fan of that particular driver. Let's try and look at this carefully, pragmatically. Let's try and understand how we can find a solution to keep great racing without the stewards getting so overly involved, it prevents that great racing happening. I'd love to know your thoughts. And in the meantime, between now and next race, please go and download the Seedream app. It will give you all of your Formula One news and content. It'll keep you up to date with the very latest news in all formats, with everything grouped really nicely around particular breaking news stories or particular topics and subjects. Give it a try. I'm sure you're going to like it. I'd love to know what you think on that as well. Hit me up, drop me a line, and have a wonderful week. See you soon, guys.